So hello everyone, my name is Bob Ferrari and I am a supply chain industry analyst. I've been covering the supply chain technology space for goodness knows over 30 years, I hate to say it. But I finally got a guest who matches me in our wisdom. So this is maybe a great video interview and we hope it will be for you, all of you. So I've been covering this space for a long time. In 2008, 2009, after having tenure at two high-profile supply chain industry analyst firms, I decided to go independent, put out my own shingle. I founded what is now called the Supply Chain Matters blog. It has global-wide readership. It's gotten constant recognition. And in addition, I do a lot of consulting and advisory services for companies that are dealing with their supply chain technology or process decision-making needs. And I deal with technology providers about lots of things having to do with the market, strategy, and so forth. So that's what I'm about. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Tom Moore. And I'll let Tom describe his background.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. You said in supply chain for 40 years and
30.
I've been 40, so
Okay.
we're ahead of you. And started out doing things, getting dirt under the fingernails by running truck fleets and running warehouses and operating plant planning and scheduling and being in the whole planning community. So started out actually doing something before we went into the whole consulting business and then started the software company. So, real world background, that's been the important thing.
Absolutely.
And I think most people who are in the business really want to have somebody who's been there, done that, and has the lash marks on their back to prove it.
And loss of hair as well.
Well, I got the gray hair.
You got it, I do. Okay. So let's get started. So let me get a bit of a perspective here on where we are right now. We've come a long way in supply chain planning. From the days when I first covered this technology, when it was just a black box tool set that vendors would provide to you, and then you had to figure out how to do it. How would you apply it to demand planning, as an example? Or how would you do it to supply planning and things like that? And then, a lot of these startups quickly understood that you just can't put a black box in the market. You got to put a suite of applications that are packaged, that are user-friendly. So we went to the notion of supply chain planning suites, which had all these capabilities and individual applications and things like that. And then they expanded from there and they went into other dimensions. And in all of this, one of the things that when I talk with planning audiences and I would talk with experts like Tom from the execution area is this notion that unfortunately planning has always operated in its own silo. That it operates in the sense of here are the plans, here is the demand plans, here are the supply plans. We try to do an optimization against both of them. We do some decision making, we do some balancing of inventory management, whatever. And then when we get to that point, we execute the plan. But oftentimes there is no visibility downstream to how does that impact execution in the sense of all those execution processes. So a lot of that, comes to the notion of, well, what about transportation cost factors or warehouse congestion or, basically the flow of materials through the whole logistics pipeline and all of those things, because that necessarily wasn't a concern of planners because they were doing the plan. And then they expected execution people like Tom to be able to do the execution side. And that's kind of where it's been, but now there's a new awareness. There's a term going out now about supply chain synchronization. Other companies may have a different term for it, but it's the notion of how do we look at this end to end, not just within planning, but end to end. Planning, execution, and everything that goes in between. And coupled with this is the notion that as we deal with supply chain processes and decision-making needs, we, like many other functions, we bring in lots of other data. So we have to bring in ERP data about master planning, material requirements planning, bills of material, all these other factors. We deal with the execution systems, whether it's transportation management, whether it's warehouse management, and so forth. But the connections depend on the age of the particular planning application, whether it's an older legacy versus a newer one. Some of them could be multiple. If you're in a big company, you may have multiple ERP systems and execution systems that you got to bring together and that sort of thing. So those are all important considerations here. And this tends to generate, what we can say is incremental costs. Probably as Tom, and I'd love to be with Tom because he really talks about, I don't want to take his thunder, but the hidden costs that are involved here. Like volume fluctuations. The notion that if you're in a warehouse and typically on a Monday or Tuesday, you're going to get 5 shipments a day. And then later in the week, when the CPG companies are starting to now replenish downstream for weekend sales, all of a sudden you're going to see 20, 30, 40 shipments in a day. How do you plan a work shift? Or do you have to plan multiple work shifts for that? And how much notice do you have? So that's a hidden cost factor. And then the notion of on time and full, where you're going to get penalties if you have a retailer like Walmart who strictly adheres to that. If your truck isn't there when it's supposed to be, when your inventory is not there, that's not good. It's not good at all. And then there's this whole notion that Tom has educated me on, even though I didn't believe that could happen.
Didn't believe me, Bob?
I didn't believe him, but there is now technology that can optimize how you load a trailer, to the highest efficiency, which is great. So let's start off with my question for Tom. In your presentations, you often quote an anonymous VP of Transportation saying, I got to read this, "We deploy a premium cost product that may not be needed from sites that may struggle to ship to sites that may not be able to receive it." So what are these pain levels that he's talking about?
When you're a transportation guy and one day you get a request to ship on a particular lane 2 loads, and the next day you get a request to ship on the same lane 20 loads, that's a pain point because the concept of core carriers exists in most large CPG companies. High volume CPG guys will have a core carrier that they bid, say on average we're going to give you 350 loads a year, okay? Approximately 1 a day. So carriers say, okay, 1 a day. Then they get asked for 5. Well, it's a cost to the carrier if they try and cover those 5 loads. And then the next day they offer them none. And they go, well, what just happened? And so from a carrier's perspective, they see pain, okay? But they build that pain back into the rates a little bit. They build extra dead miles, those kinds of things. From the perspective of the transportation VP, he sees that he's got a routing guide that says this is the best carrier and this is the best price that I pay, and then's the next one, and then's the next one, and the next one. Well, unfortunately, as he goes down that routing guide, the problem becomes quite straightforward that he's paying more money. And that's where it's sort of a hidden cost. It's just, the cost on this lane on average is maybe $2.75 a mile, but the reality is the best cost carrier might only be $2 a mile. Okay?
Yeah.
And it gets even worse because when you start to think about some of the longer lanes, you've got a intermodal, for example, is the primary source, but intermodal at some points in time it runs out of trailers. So, hey, I'm trying to ship 20 loads, but only 10 can go intermodal. Now another 10 have to go truck at far higher cost and far higher carbon. So we've got a lot of transportation inefficiencies. But the transportation guy is not also concerned, or as much concerned about the guys in the warehouse, and you mentioned it before. It's warehouse efficiency, right? One of our clients estimated that they overmanned in some of their warehouses by up to 10 people because of these fluctuations.
That's a lot.
Because you can't send somebody home every day, oh, you didn't get the loads we were expecting, and the next day, oh, could you work an extra 5 hours of overtime so you can, we can get all these things unloaded.
Yeah.
And
or the opposite. I brought in 15 people, but it turned out I only needed half of those,
And then you get down to the OTIF fines. So you get 20 trucks arriving. Hold on. How do I unload them all? And the Walmart shipment that needs some of the product that's in truck number 19, they can't bring that in time. So guess what? It runs out of that product, and they short Walmart. So a lot of opportunities for really, I'll call it pain in the supply chain. And no one upstream in the planning area experiences that pain. And often, as you know this, so many companies have a different group of people, and that planning's in one group and operations is another, and it doesn't get up until the chief supply chain officer where everybody comes together. So it's kind of difficult to go into the planning offices if you're a transportation guy with a baseball bat, because you're in a different silo.
And then there's the need for all the expediters that suddenly come into the picture to say, hey, well, what's going on here? Well, let me check the shipment. Let me go check this. Let me go check that. And then...
Yeah, how do I find carriers? I mean, there was a guy who originally brought us into this, a guy called Jay Rich III, and he worked for a food company. And Jay Rich, God bless him, he said, yes, load optimization, getting more stuff on a truck, that's a great idea. He said, but this is killing me. He said, I got extra people because I've got to move stuff on. And one day that I've got no trucks, and the next day I've got so much demand that I can't find trucks.
Right.
And he's trying to work refrigerated, and you know what happens there.
Yeah.
I was chatting today with somebody who moves hazardous product, and he said, you have no idea how hard it is to move hazardous product when somebody hits you with extra loads on a day. He says, you have no idea.
Yeah.
So it's a real pain that should be mitigated up in the planning area.
Yeah. So the good news here is that planning people are starting to understand this. Okay?
We hope so.
We hope so, yes. But I'm hearing some good things. And the good things also is some of them are starting to look downstream and trying to include that into the planning information flows or data flows. Okay, so that's a good thing. But still there's a lot of work, coordinated work, that needs to get done from both ends. And I know your firm is doing some great things, partnering with a planning company and doing that. And I think there'll be more as well. And one thing we haven't even talked about is, and this whole notion came to the notions of the brokers now that came in, the startup brokers, like, we won't name names here, but
some of whom you didn't need to name the names because they weren't there for that long. But,
yeah, that made some money on this whole inefficiency that was going on.
Well, they make money on inefficiency, Bob, but they also make money because if you look at the trucking industry in the United States, it's so fragmented, and the majority of trucking companies have less than 5 trucks.
I've heard that. Yes.
And so, what do they use a broker for? Is more of a sales arm. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've got to understand the fragmentation adds to the value of a broker. And if I was a carrier and I had 10, 20 trucks, I'd probably be working with brokers too.
Yeah.
Where the challenges come in with brokers is, you have a less predictable equipment base, and that does hurt you on load optimization because you've got to plan for the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge because if you've got a regular core carrier, and we've got companies that are shipping 50,000 pounds on some of their shipments, but they've got 3 trucks a day that go on this lane that they can use, and you can only plan for 3 trucks because that's all there are, and that's a core carrier. They're happy with that. If they have to go to a broker, they've got to drop that all the way back down to maybe 45.5 or 46.
Yeah.
And that's a real cost to them in terms of on a per pound basis going forward.
Absolutely. So let's go on to another topic, Tom. One of the areas that often frustrates me as a supply chain industry analyst are supply chain technology companies that very much talk about end-to-end visibility. And, at one point it resonates with companies and supply chain practitioners about end-to-end visibility. That sounds good, but what does that really mean? And sometimes there's a little vacuum there. What does that mean? Especially to the operations and logistics part of the business. So I thought you would be a great voice for that. So what in your mind is end-to-end visibility?
Well, visibility is one of these things. We need to know how much inventory we've got. We need to have that as visible. We need to know approximately when things are arriving and when things are leaving. Okay? We have got to be able to predict labor and all those other things.
Yep.
But one of the problems is visibility has got the so what problem. So we know it. What do we do now? Okay. The warehouse is full. Okay, we've got that visibility. We're trying to deploy to that warehouse. It's really, really full. What do we do? All right. That's the important thing. It's the so what. And when we talk about visibility, I always think about this really in terms of multiple things. Just the straight visibility. Yeah, we can see the inventory. We can see that the warehouse is full. Number one, we can see, okay, we can predict that maybe tomorrow when we send all these trucks in, the warehouse is going to be full. That's predictive.
Yeah.
Okay. We can go to prescriptive and say, oh, the warehouse is going to be full tomorrow, therefore don't ship these trucks today. Okay. That works.
Mm-hmm.
I want to introduce a new term.
All right.
I'll call it performative.
Performative.
Okay. I've got all this data. I know the warehouse is full. Now, I don't need somebody to prescribe to tell me. I know that if I send this truck, it's going to sit in the yard for 2 days, so let's not send the truck.
Right.
Right. So performative is to do the things. And I think that's the real thing. So predictive, what's going to happen? Prescriptive, here's what you should do about it. Performative, do it.
Right.
Do it. And that's the thing. But here's go back to your siloed comments from before. Here we've got these silos. The silos are the planning folks are not seeing the warehouse as full. Okay? That's part of the problem.
Right.
The planning folks are not seeing the transportation cost or the carrier capabilities. And therefore, when we've got these siloed systems, we've got all that data exists in most big companies. You've got the ERP that knows what's in transit, what's in every location, when things are going to arrive. You've got the WMS, you've got the TMS, you've got the planning system. All those things are there, but they're not kind of joined together, for the want of a better term.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of limit to responsiveness. And we've got the visibility platforms too, which I shouldn't leave out, the Forkites and the Project 44s.
That's right.
Who are telling you, hey, this is going to be late or this is going to be, which is all valuable data.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. But what do you do about it?
Right. And I can give the other example on the planning side. The planning folks may be looking at a particular shipment that, was a normal inventory replenishment that got somehow hung up in production and came off the line maybe a day late. So then they're expediting on their end to get it to where it needs to go. And maybe one of the stops was an interim DC before it went to the store level or whatever. So they've seen that information and they're basically saying, you don't need to put this away. You really need to just receive it, cross-dock it, and move it over here. But if they don't tell the other side, the execution side, you need to do this ahead of time, or you need to, allocate a door so you can do cross-dock, what happened?
Now, you've been talking to my friends over at AutoScheduler, haven't you?
I have.
I can tell that.
I have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's the story.
Yeah.
But the whole thing on visibility, it isn't about knowing where the truck is. It's knowing what the heck you're going to do about it when you do know where the truck is.
Yes.
Or even better, knowing that, hey, I'm not going to ship that truck. Those are the key things. Or it's not going to get to arrive at this particular day, we're going to delay it a day.
Exactly.
So those are the key things on end-to-end visibility.
Yeah. And then we should delve a little into the data management part of this, because there's always been this layering of data. We talk about the term we use is edge data in manufacturing. So, manufacturing lines, they have operational data that tells how production equipment is operating, how manufacturing is producing product, and so forth and so on. And they try to connect to MRP systems, quality management systems, and things like that. And then that's one granularity of data right at the operational level.
Yep.
So, that's hourly, so to speak, for a notion of that. Then you got another layer of data that we just talked about: planning, orders, inventory, those kinds of things. And then when they make their way to the execution on, your end of that aspect, it's a combination of both, because you've got operational data that you've got to deal with, which you just described, and you've got this other data about orders and inventory and things like that, whether they need to go.
There's a lot of moving parts here,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's the whole challenge. And that's why we actually believe you have to create a digital twin, right? So you know what's going on. You've got all this data from all these different places. You've pulled it together in a I'll call it a model, but a twin of what the supply chain is. And when you take that twin of the supply chain and you turn it and say, okay, how do I make this more efficient? You now can test different scenarios.
Right.
We happen to use optimization to actually drive the best scenario.
Yes.
But it's understanding the digital twin. And where most people fall down on this is they think about things, and I'll talk about high volume consumer goods again. They think about things in terms of, hey, I want to expedite these 20 cases or these 50 cases. Well, that's not how the business runs. That's not how the business runs at all. The business runs in such a way that we ship trucks from plants to warehouses, or from one warehouse to another, and we have to prioritize and manage things in truckload quantities. And that's why you have to have a very accurate digital twin.
Yep.
Okay? Because if you're just worried about 20 cases, no one's going to ship 20 cases in most of our client base. Okay? They're going to ship a full truckload, 1,500, 1,000, 2,000 cases, and they're going to try and make sure that is the most important set of products on those trucks. And that's another key point. There's a limited capacity in the supply chain, right? I mean, as much as we like to think we've got an infinite number of trucks, and for, I guess, if you're prepared to pay an infinite amount of money, you can almost get an infinite number of trucks.
Sometimes that happens.
The reality is you've got a limit to how many trucks you should be using. If you can pre-position those trucks, you can then wait until the last minute to determine what goes on those trucks. So there's some of the things that you can do with a digital twin of the network.
Yeah,
okay.
A very important point too. Okay, I think we're ready to transition to the next one.
Yes, we are. We've missed a whole page, but that's okay. Keep going. Yep. No, it's okay. A page of my notes, not yours.
Okay. All right, we ready?
Yeah, whenever you.
It's continuing.
Yeah, just continue.
Okay.
I don't want to go through the last thing we went through last time.
So, Tom, I read an interview held with Scott DeGroot of Kimberly-Clark that outlined their journey to link planning and execution. And when I read it, I thought, wow, this is really a nice case study. It's kind of superb. And essentially, it was, when COVID hit, the COVID pandemic, it was a reset moment for companies like Kimberly and the consumer products good. And especially Kimberly, when you think of the fact that, they produce toilet paper, paper towels, health products, all those kinds of things, like talking about being in the epicenter of a global pandemic. And I was writing about this in, Supply Chain Matters, and I was trying to pick and choose in my commentaries where they would be. And Kimberly was clearly one of them. The sanitizer companies were another one that, were really in the epicenter. And there was a few others as well. And I sort of knew in my gut, covering supply chain for a long, long time, this is going to be the basis of case study coming up. So I was really intrigued when I read that, because here it is, right? So as it was, when that happened, Kimberly viewed that as the learning experiment, that said, this is an opportunity to better understand where logistics and customer service really needs to be. And more importantly, where the costs are and what do we need to do to improve on that as much as we can by continuing to maintain the service level agreements that we need to do. So according to the case study, that resulted in Project Earl, which is early AM release and leveling. And the primary focus was on batching orders from manufacturing facilities that would not necessarily spike the DCs without context. Context to overall transportation planning, the amount of daily labor requirements for individual DCs and things like that. They were looking for a tool that had capability to make recommendations about thousands of daily orders or hundreds of shipping lanes and destinations. How were they going to optimize all of those things? But not only from a planning perspective, as we talked about before, but also the operations perspective around, how do we mitigate or mediate cost while we're doing that? So we can work both sides of the equation, the end-to-end that we were talking about. And Earl was developed with a tool in collaboration with your company, Provision AI.
Indeed, and the whole the project name was Earl, but the tool was Provision AI's level load product and our load optimization product. Mm-hmm. And so let's just talk. COVID was clearly a major disruption, and that was an impetus. But the key thing that was really most large CPG companies have the same problem, and you and I are part of it, because we go to the grocery store on Friday night, Saturday, or Sunday, and 70% of grocery sales are on those 3 days.
Right.
So now there's a replenishment requirement from the grocer's warehouse, and then there's a replenishment requirement to replenish the grocer's warehouse. And so you can now start to understand that there's a definite problem that demand is fluctuating, and therefore resupply is fluctuating. If you remember the old beer game,
Yeah.
we have the beer game going on just about every week. So if you think about it in those terms. The thing is that most modern planning systems truly understand what is happening, and they've broken that down day by day, going out for days, sometimes months.
Right.
Okay. That data is generally ignored by most people. Okay? And they say, well, we're going to plan today, and today's Monday, so we're going to plan to make shipments on Wednesday or Thursday. And they don't look out further. Okay? What Project Earl and Level Load did was to say, we're going to look out 30 days, and we're going to see all these things that are happening. Month end's coming. Okay, there's going to be a big spike of shipments at month end out of the customer-facing distribution centers. So we don't want to put a whole bunch of replenishment in at that time, because we won't have time to unload it. The labor is going to be used to ship to customers, not to unload trucks. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. And so by looking out 30 days and using some very sophisticated math, we're able to smooth out that flow over 30 days. Just make sure, though, we are absolutely working to maximize customer service. Okay, we are going to have that inventory. Right. That's a key point. So we now have an alignment between what we see is going to go out of our customer-facing distribution centers and how we're going to resupply. And that resupply might be pulled forward. I've only got a few days of supply. I'm going to pull it forward. I've got a lot of days of supply. I might even push it back.
Right.
So I don't have to have these spikes that come in, day out, okay? And oh, by the way, that gets rid of a lot of the hidden costs. Okay?
Right, exactly.
Kimberly-Clark also was very smart. They did something else that we worked on together. And that was, they said, the carrier doesn't care. They don't care what's on the truck as long as they know they need to provide 53-foot dry van, and I need to do that on Friday. So Kimberly-Clark has level load do the tendering early AM, hence Earl. So by 5 AM, all the trucks are tendered.
Okay.
But we don't actually say what's going to go on the truck. Now, level load knows what it wants to put on each of the trucks going out into this, because it has to load all those trucks to understand the priority and all those other important things, so we maintain customer service.
Yeah.
But the carrier doesn't need to know. And, we don't have to make that decision until just before we ship it. So on, say, Thursday, on Monday, we run at 5 AM. We've tendered the loads for Friday. And on Friday, we can't just build the loads just as that, because the plant needs a little time to react. So Thursday, we are building the loads and saying what's going to go on each one of those trucks. So on Monday, we reserve 5 trucks. On Thursday, we build the actual contents of each of those 5 trucks, update it. And so now you've got a huge advantage on OTIF, right?
Yes.
Because you've got an extra 4 days worth of data, basically, of orders and everything that's in there. You know what inventory you're going to have.
Right.
But you've also got an advantage with your carrier, right? Because your carrier now has close to 5 days notice, whereas in the old days it was maybe 2.
Right.
And,
Maybe less.
and my old dad had a saying: "First up, best dressed."
Yeah.
Having 3 sons was okay.
Yeah.
And so we were able to get ahead of everybody else, and that meant that what the critical measure is what's called first tender acceptance. Did we get the carrier we wanted? That went from a dismal set of numbers to the high 90s.
Wow. That's
and
impressive.
Percentage, a very big thing. So what did that do for us? Well, it eliminated a huge amount of premium freight, okay, and i.e.
Cost.
we were always using our lowest cost carrier, and that alone, according to Kimberly-Clark, was millions of dollars.
Yes.
Okay, we reduced, and I won't say eliminated because you never do that. You reduced a number of OTIF fines and those service failures. Okay, we didn't have trucks lined up. We reduced a number of the I'll call it the spikes at the warehouses, both on the shipping and receiving side, and that enabled us to basically cut our labor force and certainly not have to suffer those incredible peaks, and we think we're overmanned. So we eliminated a lot of overtime and a lot of pain points. So during COVID, all those things meant, hey, Kimberly-Clark had a huge advantage.
Yeah.
After COVID, they still have a huge advantage.
Yeah. And as I recall, we were talking before about the connection of planning with execution. They had that perspective going into this.
Yeah, they are smarter than the average beer,
Yeah.
To use the Yogi Bear saying.
Yeah.
They really understood it. And it goes back to software in many ways is easy. Culture and managing people are much harder. Those guys really got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I give them a huge amount of credit. Okay. They understood. We collaborated on getting people trained, understanding things, getting people to understand. Hey, we start out small. It worked really, really well. Everybody liked it. They didn't have to do near as much work. Before Project Earl, people were coming in. They tell me at 5:30 in the morning to try and get trucks tendered by lunchtime.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now they come in at 7:30 in the morning, and everything's done for them. And they may have to fix a couple of things because there's exceptions.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, they've made the quality of life for those planners way up.
Great.
Okay.
Great story. Great case study.
Wonderful people. Can't speak highly enough of Kimberly-Clark.
Good. Very good. So while we're on the topic of disruption, as Tom and I are talking right now, multiple industry supply chain teams are dealing with the implication of very significant tariffs and potentially higher trade conflicts that's bringing, bringing about a lot of business uncertainty right now. And it's going to hit the supply chain area a lot. And I've already driven, we're at a conference, Tom and I've had some conversations with companies while we're here. I know Tom has as well. And we're already hearing, the notions of, whoa, this is maybe the equivalent of what we saw in COVID, because it comes at both ends. It comes on the notion of impacts to cost and supply and where you do it. And it could come, who knows? Nobody knows at this point because it's still settling out. It could be on the demand side as well, because if your products cost more or if you're forced to hike prices, then you're dealing with demand elasticity and things like that, whatever that may be. And, we as analysts, not like Tom, who does the daily operational thinking and all that stuff, we as analysts, we look at a lot of data, and we look especially at survey data, executives. And, as I've observed supply chains, many industry supply chains over the years, you look for the notions of when executives look at supply chain in the lens as a cost driver, purely as a lens of cost driver, which was the time when we went to outsourcing. So when a lot of materials started to get outsourced in China and Asia and everything, that was the lens of supply chain as a cost center. Then we transitioned more to, and especially in COVID, supply chain as the enabler of what we need to get done from business metrics perspective. We have goals around profitability, cost of goods sold, customer service levels, OTIF, as we talked about in consumer, and other industries have similar customer metrics. So now we've got the potential for all of this to bubble up again. And there was a recent survey taken about 2 months ago, and I brought it to the attention of Tom, and I said, let's talk about this, because this was a survey, it was a unique one because it focused in on CFOs and what they were thinking of just as this news of tariffs was hitting the news waves and it was starting to percolate. And it was the notion of how they were translating this to supply chain expectations. And interesting enough, it came back to say the notions were, we want to look at supply chain again, and the notion of it still needs to be our business enabler because we understand it more now after COVID, and we understand the importance of it. But from this dimension, there's also a cost dimension that's put into this now, okay? Because it means that when we're uncertain about where the business is going, where the economy is going, we have to think about costs. Reluctantly, but we have to. So, the question, I guess, is how do you view this challenge, again, under this notion of hidden costs? And basically, what should supply chain operational leaders be advocating in terms of added capabilities now? I mean, we've talked about things that are already happening, but how do you see that?
Well, so it always comes down to cost. I mean, every survey I've seen, 70+% of things are, what's your most important priority for supply chain? Cost.
Right.
Cost, 70%. Okay. So what's the C-suite seeing? Well, it is critical. You've got to have a supply chain, but they do see it as a cost center. And what we see is continual demands to reduce cost, but do not impact service.
Service, yes.
Okay. And even worse, you see companies that go out and say, we want to serve everybody at the same incredible level of fill rate. And I understand that desire, but sometimes that's a challenge. But the operational reality is, that go back to the term used, hidden costs. Okay. How do you shake the tree and get more money out? Okay. And you do that by driving increased productivity. Okay? And productivity, number one, know, go back to loading trucks. You said that early in this conversation. How do we get more stuff on each truck so that we can ship fewer trucks? So it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
That's a productivity improvement. And there's a very straight mathematical problem that's incredibly difficult to solve. So what do you do to get more stuff on each truck? Well, you use something like our OTIF software, which does all the math for you to look at it. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people drink Diet Coke. Some people drink Coke, right? 12-ounce can, they're about the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're not exactly the same because the 12-ounce can of regular Coke has sugar in it, and it weighs slightly more.
Interesting.
So when you have a whole pallet of Coke, most people would think, I'm going to ship a whole truckload of Coke, and then I'll ship a whole truckload of Diet Coke, and that'll be good. But if you actually mix the two cleverly, you can actually get one more pallet of Coke on the truck. So rather than shipping a straight truck of one and a straight truck of another, and so it's not intuitive, but it's mathematically correct. Okay?
Wow.
So those are that's one hidden cost. Okay?
Yeah.
The second hidden cost is we talked about earlier, and that is how do we use the carriers that have given us the best prices, and how do we consistently work with them? And even better, how do they give us lower prices? Okay, so let's talk about the consistency. We talked about the spiking of the supply plan. If we smooth that out, that gives us a big advantage. Okay, and we can get more of our first tender acceptance at a much higher level. That's a big savings thing, and it's not trivial. I mean, we're talking across the whole supply planning area, somewhere in the 4% range of total supply chain, of
Wow.
total what we call primary freight from plants to DCs. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a big number.
That is, yes.
So you got load optimization, which can give you 5 to 10%. You've got this 4%. So now how do we get the carrier rates down? Most companies don't fully understand that carriers build into their rates, distance and fuel and the probability of getting a backhaul and all these other things, driver wages, insurance, etc. But they also build in a couple of other pieces. They build in deadhead, and they build in, I'll call it idle time. Okay, and idle time's not waiting for a load. It's because one day I got 20 loads and that was great. And the next day I got 2 loads. What do I do with a piece of equipment?
Yeah.
I've got to find something for that piece of equipment to do, and it's not always the most efficient thing that I can possibly do.
Right.
So the more I can give a carrier a smooth set of shipments, you're going to get 3 shipments a day every day. It might go to 4, might go to 2, but I'm going to get a steady number. They're seeing a physical reduction in their cost. They're getting less of that deadhead, and they're getting less of that waiting, what am I going to do with the truck kind of concept. That should result in decreases in freight rates.
I would think so. Yeah.
And again, another hidden cost. Are we squeezing the carrier? No, we're making him more efficient.
Right. Exactly.
So
it's a win-win.
It's a huge win-win.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's difficult for companies to model and understand, but I think it's very straightforward. Again, a hidden cost doesn't come quickly, but it comes at the end of a period of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a good explanation of that. Absolutely. So let's go to the final question. We'll stop right there. You okay so far?
Yeah, we're doing fine.
Okay. So a final question, Tom, would be operations teams have the benefits of leveraging increased automation such as robotics, connected vehicles, and more real-time visibility. So we touched upon a lot of those. So everybody wants to know about the future. So how do you view the future of supply chain execution and logistics? Not only on what you just described and the capabilities that are already being done right now, but let's talk about the newer technologies that are on the forefront now. A lot of people are talking about AI and what that's going to mean, particularly on all the ends of supply chain. What's your perspective on that?
Well, first of all, everyone uses the term AI, and I'm not sure we've got a good definition of AI. There are lots of different forms of AI, but people just think about it as being generative AI, Chat GPT, etc. And there are some places where that can be very helpful in supply chain, but it's predominantly in terms of helping with training and helping with I'll call it explaining why the systems did this or did that. Okay, that's another very valid reason.
Yeah.
When we think about AI and the whole of the systems area, what's the key driver here? Key driver, I think, is, I'll call it a convergence. We have to converge those silos that we have to bring them together. The planning silo and the execution silo, we have to bring them together.
Exactly.
And that's easier said than done. Systems are part of it. Incentives are part of it. Even in the supply chain itself, even in the execution part of the supply chain between warehousing and transportation, the warehouse guys are trying to say, oh, how do I do the least amount of labor in my picking? And the transportation guys saying, you're not filling up my trucks because you're not picking efficiently, etc. Different costs, etc. This is a nickel holding up a dollar, as the old saying goes.
Yes.
But we have to have aligned incentives across the network, and I think that's a valid point.
Right.
From a skills perspective, I think we have to do a number of things. We've got in planning, we see a lot of turnover, and so you have we have to have a skill base, either where people continue to stay things in planning, or we have to make it very much the systems are performative and trustworthy. Okay, those are the important things. You can't you can't have the systems doing things,
right,
and have the planners doing basically exception work. Okay, so the planning systems and the execution systems have to be aware and understanding how to get the operations running. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really people don't fully understand is robots, automation. They operate at a speed. People operate at a variable speed.
Yep.
If you're busy, people will work faster and get more stuff done. If you're slow, people will work slower. Robots, everything work at the same pace. So now you've got to understand that if you're behind with automation, you're behind, and you're never going to get ahead, because it's going to run at this rate constantly. So how do I respond to it? The auto scheduler approach has been really smart. They think about things in terms of agents, and these things do things, and they have a certain rate, and we can plan around that rate to make sure things aren't late, to make sure that we're as productive as possible. And it goes back to all these expenses that you've got, and to make sure that the robots and other things are used to their best ability. Particularly, as the future goes, what's going to happen is that you're going to have robots that you can say, oh, this is no longer just a picking robot. This is a robot that can do maybe create assortments, or this is a robot that can do all of the things that people are doing today.
Yep.
And therefore, being able to position those robots in the right place at the right time to get the productivity and the throughput in the warehouse is critical.
Yeah.
Again, a great auto scheduler, they've really mastered that whole discussion, right. and that's a very, very valuable.
And your points, Tom, about trucks and all that efficiency that for trucks and for fleets and for truck operators and everything, robot is just another physical device.
It is not another physical device.
Right.
As much as you want to get a truck to go at 100 miles an hour, there are certain laws that says you can't do that.
That's right.
So the transit time, unless you put team drivers on, is going to be
right.
what it is.
Right.
Okay? And so there's a lot of things that you have to manage through from a very, I'll call it, fixed understanding of the capability of each of the things in the supply chain.
Yeah. So we wouldn't be remiss without closing on this futures topic about talking about people skills. because that's a very important area for a lot of our supply chain audience. I've done a number of webinars on this. I just finished a few weeks ago doing one with a very high-profile supply chain recruiter who does podcasts and everything, and we talked about this in terms of how people can prepare, how supply chain people can prepare to be able to move their careers into this area, into these areas, and be prepared for that. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that. So let's begin. What do you think on that aspect of that?
We've got a lot of people who today have been transactional. They very much, I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. Systems can do that. So we're not going to have people doing transactional things. So we need people who can do, the level one thinking, which is, how do I make this work, make this system work? But the level two thinking about, okay, how do I handle this exception? How do I manage this? What does this mean? Now, putting it in accounting sense, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a warehouse, and he said, look, I get the warehouse P&L he runs a bunch of warehouses. I get these warehouse P&Ls for all these places, and somehow the labor costs per unit in this location is different than the labor cost over here. And that's level one. Level two is, why is that happening?
Yeah.
Okay. And we've got that in the supply chain every day with every possible thing you can think about. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Every activity, every exception. Why did that happen? What can we do to prevent it? And getting into that whole solution methodology, people are going to have to move from transaction to level two, level three thinking.
Right.
And the key skills are going to be data literacy. It's going to be an inquiring mind. I mean, I'll hire somebody who's got an inquiring mind.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes a huge difference over, people who kind of maybe just think that they can be a transactional robot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Very much so. I've heard technology companies, and particularly in the robotics field, as I mentioned, but others as well, talk about, the notion of gamification, gamers.
Yeah.
Excellent skills.
Excellent skills, but again, I don't necessarily want somebody gamifying.
No, that's true.
My inventory.
Yeah, that's true.
Problems, but
having the notion of looking at the situational awareness.
Yep.
Okay, and what are the options here?
And getting the bad guy before he gets you.
Yeah, whatever.
Exactly.
It's that sort of thing. And when I've talked about it, it's the whole notion of, preparing your skills base to be able to interact with technology. Be the interactor. The notion that, even Amazon today talks about career paths that say you can get into interaction with robotics. You can be a coordinator of robotics in the facility, that sort of thing. You can work your way into these other technology career paths, so forth. And other companies are doing the same. So it's the notion of being prepared for that. It is coming. There is some time. There's still things that need to get done here, as we've talked about, and I've talked about in other forums as well. But, it will be coming. So now's the time to prepare. Be prepared. Think about all these things. Think about how you can, attune your skills to these areas now to interact with technology. Don't be afraid of it. Interact with it. Get comfortable with it.
I'm going to tell the story of my mother-in-law, God rest her soul. When she was working, she said, they're going to bring in a computer and to do some inventory planning and some shop scheduling. And she said, when that comes in, I'm going. Okay. Well, it came in. And I said, how's it going? She said, oh, it's great. It saves me a lot of time. It really makes me. He said, I don't have to worry about all the details now. I can work out what's going to happen. And if something happens that's bad, an exception, in other words, I can jump in and get people to resolve that, or I can resolve it myself. Mm-hmm. Now, what a change. What happened?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it comes back to that thing. My mother. I didn't think my mother-in-law would be the most receptive to these things, but
Right.
God bless her, she took it in a stride and did a great
Great
job.
example.
And it's possible because we always think about young people and gamification. You're talking about gamification. Us old dogs there's still a few tricks in us old dogs,
we
you
do.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can learn new things and do stuff,
Yeah.
which will be, to our credit.
Yeah.
And I look out there and think we've got a need for senior managers, CEOs, VPs, to understand that they have a role in developing talent.
Absolutely.
And
Best message of all.
and we're not going to just test them on, can they fill this box in? We have to test them on can they think, and we have to understand and train them to say, how do we manage all this technology? And you use the example of naming your robot. I have a Roomba at home. Do you think it's got a name? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
But you go back to how do we drive individuals who have been working in the company, loyal, good people, how do we drive them to have a much more satisfying job experience?
Right,
okay?
right.
And I like to say that by putting systems in that you can trust and having them working on things where they can really feel like they're adding value gives you a great deal of job satisfaction. But we've got to train them to help them do
Absolutely.
that.
And my soapbox has always been, let's get away from this job description, job rec kind of perspective, and let's get to the notion of these are the skills profile of the people that I need in this role, because this role is constantly going to change. So I need a certain level of skills, people who can think creatively, people who are comfortable with interacting with technology, people who have those critical thinking skills, whatever it is, hire to the skills level, because then you got the flexibility in the organization to be able to align work depending on where all this goes, so to speak. So we're going to get there. Okay. All right. So let's go to closing. So perhaps in closing, first of all, Tom, this has been great. This
is fun. Yeah, working with you, Bob, is always fun.
It's great. I mean, you get two old timers in a room, and we could go forever. We might have chapter 4 or 5 later on, whatever. So let's leave some important takeaways for our listeners and our viewers right now. What's your takeaway from all of this?
The takeaway is one, you're going to continue to be challenged on cost. You've got to work on that. There are a couple of hidden costs that can pull a lot of money out of your supply chain, particularly if you're high volume consumer products or high volume healthcare, anything that's high volume where you're moving a lot of products. We have to converge planning and execution, because that's one of the levers that removes that problem of additional cost and hidden cost. And if we can do those things, we can then come back to our management and say, we've cut your costs, we've done it in an intelligent way, there's been a very high ROI. I mean, we're talking months, not years.
Yes.
And we can leverage that to get other improvements in the supply chain that'll help us further. Great.
And my takeaway is that in all my years in supply chain, not only as an analyst, but all the other things, supply chain is a dynamic world. It is a dynamic profession. The more people get into it, they love it as a career. There's never a dull day in supply chain, as we all know. Never a dull day. And it's just going to keep going. And the notion of supply chain is we're always ready for change. We're always responding to things, but we want to do it in a very positive way. So the takeaway is this is just another change that's coming our way that, we will deal with it. We will get it done eventually. And, we'll have the people, the resources and the technology that best suits that, and we'll get it done. So that's my takeaway from this. So great to have it. It's been a good conversation. As always, wisdom. You know, he keeps me in line, folks. So this is Bob Ferrari and Tom Moore signing off and wishing all our listeners and viewers for your success in your personal and as well as your business endeavors. And as I always close out on our podcast on Supply Chain Matters, always remember supply chains do matter for successful business outcomes. Goodbye, everyone.